Can a person be good without God? We've been going through this series, A Reason for Our Hope, and talking about apologetics, giving reason for our faith, acquiring tools for engaging people who do not believe in Jesus Christ, people with other worldviews and faiths. How do we communicate the gospel to someone who believes that the Bible is a fairy tale? Well, we should dispel the idea that we're a people of blind faith, a people who cannot use our minds as critical thinkers. And in a sense, we engage unbelievers on the intellectual battlefields that they've chosen. We look at the evidence in the sciences, philosophy, archaeology, humanities, in the hopes that lies would be challenged and that doors may be opened for the gospel. We also hope that we ourselves will grow in confidence that the Bible, that this book is really real, not because we say it is, but because it is truly true. The evidence points to Jesus Christ, who is the truth, the life, the way. We've considered some scientific evidence for the existence of God, and today we're considering what's called the moral argument. It's not a question, really, of whether godless people can be moral. Can someone be moral without belief in God? Can an atheist do genuine good without faith in God? Well, without getting into prevenient grace, the answer is yes, absolutely. The question is why? Why do good? And what makes one thing good and another thing evil? What makes feeding the poor a better choice than drowning a puppy? Is it a matter of preference? Is it a matter of cultural norm? Or is it genuinely a matter of right and wrong, of good and evil? You see, the purely naturalist, materialist universe ultimately gives no reason for something like rape to be wrong, for murder to be wrong, for racism to be wrong. It's all relative, subjective, cultural, a matter of opinion and feeling, and anything can be totally justified. Nietzsche once said, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, it doesn't exist." Richard Dawkins, a leading voice of atheism, he says, "Humans have always wondered about the meaning of life, but life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. Life has no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Is this true? If so, then ethics simply becomes preference and opinion. Rape doesn't become wrong, but rather the strongest thing I could say about rape is, I don't like it. It's as much an opinion as whether or not you like pineapples on your pizza, which we've already been over that. It's preference, like whether you prefer a vanilla or chocolate frosty. But you see, in our hearts, in our gut, we know that something like rape or something like harming a child is wrong. Not a matter of opinion, but truly wrong. We know an absolute exists here, a standard of righteousness and holiness. Just turn on the TV. Look at the outrage over what's been going on in these past days. We know evil exists. Certain things are truly wrong and not a matter of opinion. And that gets us to the moral argument. It says, every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law, and therefore there must be a moral law giver. If morality is not objective, but subjective, relative to a culture or relative to a time period, then there is no moral law and nothing is truly wrong or right. Adultery could be perfectly acceptable or laudable behavior in one culture, while abhorred in another culture. And then who is to say that it won't one day be considered virtuous in that second culture? And whoever is committing adultery in that culture now would be progressive. Rape today is seen as wrong. How are you and I to know that it won't be considered right later? If it's all relative. If morality can evolve. If there's a culture where male dominance is viewed as virtuous, and rape could be seen as a valid expression of that dominance, then who would we from another culture or time be to judge them? This is not dissimilar from the question that I ended with last week about Hitler and the survival of the fittest and evolution. Who are we to judge Germany for the extinguishing of many lives? To call that wrong? Who are we to call that wrong? Unless, of course, it is truly wrong. Unless there's an actual reason for it to be wrong. See, the only reason for us to be earnestly justified in opposing rape, in opposing murder, theft, adultery, racism, is for right and wrong to be objective truths. And the only way that can be is if there's a God. Even if you disagree that objective morality exists, we all live as though objective morality exists. We know this not by what people do, but how they want to be treated. If you want to prove to somebody that objective morality exists, simply cut in front of them in line. Well, that's not fair. That's not right. People expect to be treated a certain way. C.S. Lewis, he once said, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line." You know, C.S. Lewis was once an adamant atheist who, upon seeing the injustice in the world, he would rail against the notion of a loving, sovereign God. And he recalls his conversion, his realization of the truth, in this Fuller quote that I want to read. It's well worth listening to. So hear this out. C.S. Lewis writes, "If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And for many years, I simply refused to listen to the Christian answers to this question, because I kept on feeling, whatever you say and however clever your arguments are, isn't it much simpler and easier to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power? Aren't all your arguments simply a complicated attempt to avoid the obvious?" But then this threw me back into another difficulty. How had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? See, a man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying that it was nothing but a private idea of my own, but if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe had no meaning, we should never have found out that it had no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. Evil we recognize because we know good. In asserting the brokenness of the world, the injustice and evil of the world around him, in asserting that it was proof against the existence of a just and good God, he actually found that he was logically forced to recognize that God does exist. You know, as Christians, we should wrestle with the evil in the world, but not as the people surprised by it. The evil in this world is not an indictment against the God who's revealed himself in the Bible. It's our hatred of injustice, our recoil when the innocent are slain. It ultimately points to our recognition that it ought not be this way. And the one who revealed himself through his word, he weeps too. This is not as he intended it to be, but a result of sin. And he has subjected it to this brokenness for a purpose and for a temporary time. Now, this truth doesn't erase the real hurts, and it certainly doesn't justify the evils that will be judged, if not in time, in eternity. But it is very true. The evil in this world is not evidence of the absence of God, but of the presence of a good God who is the standard by which we know what is right and wrong. See, God's law, his commands, they're not arbitrary, but they're a reflection of his nature and of our design as those who are made in his image. It ought not be this way. And the fact that we know this points to God. Now, this doesn't mean that people can't have a messed up moral compass. Plenty of people have a very real messed up moral compass. And we all are broken. Simply turn on the TV today. But the very fact that a moral compass exists is evidence of a true north, a genuine standard. Now again, we're not saying that people have to believe in God to be moral, to know right from wrong. Atheists can live moral lives. Pantheists can also be moral. And someone can claim to belong to Jesus and be immoral. We're arguing that if there is an objective moral standard, there must be a God. So you can read a book if you don't believe in authors. You just need to know how to read. But the question is, can there be such things as books without authors? No. And once again, the moral argument, every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law. Therefore, there must be a moral lawgiver. And there's a lot more that can be said about the moral argument. And I do encourage you to consider reading C.S. Lewis. If I were to point you to just one person to read regarding the moral argument, it would undoubtedly be C.S. Lewis. If you've never read Mere Christianity, it is well worth the read, as are many, many of his books. I mean, every kid should read the Chronicles of Narnia, and every adult should read the Space Trilogy. But his nonfiction is rich, including Mere Christianity and the Abolition of Man, which also hits on this topic. Next week, we're going to dive deeper into evidence specifically for our Christian faith as we look at the reliability of Scripture. Thanks for joining. I'll see you next week.